Every year, millions of people walk through Central Park without realizing something important once stood there. Homes, churches, schools, gardens, families, an entire community. Before Central Park became one of the most famous parks in the world, a small settlement called Seneca Village stood on this land. It was a community built largely by free black Americans, a place where families owned property, raised children, built churches, and created stability in a country that often denied them equal rights. Then New York decided it wanted something else, and over time the community disappeared from the map. This is the story of the American town that was erased from history, a forgotten neighborhood hidden beneath one of the most famous parks in the world. To understand why Seneca Village mattered so much, you have to understand New York City in the early 1800s. Life for black Americans was extremely difficult. Although slavery officially ended in New York State in 1827, racism and discrimination still shaped daily life. Many black New Yorkers lived in overcrowded and poor conditions downtown. Opportunities were limited. Violence and prejudice were common. And for many African Americans, owning property was almost impossible. But in the 1820s, something unusual started happening in Upper Manhattan. At the time, the area was rocky, quiet, and far away from the crowded center of the city. Most wealthy New Yorkers did not see much value in the land, but to black families searching for opportunity, it represented freedom. In 1825, African American families began buying property in the area that would later become Seneca Village. And this mattered for another important reason. At the time, black men in New York needed to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. Land ownership was not only about money, it meant political power, independence, security, and the future. Over time, the settlement grew. More families arrived, not only black residents but also Irish and German immigrants. But Seneca Village became especially important because it was one of the few places in New York where African American families could own homes and build stable lives. And unlike the stereotypes many people pushed at the time, Seneca Village was not a slum. Historical records and later archaeological discoveries showed that many residents owned property and built a functioning middle class community. Families planted gardens, children attended school, neighbors formed close relationships, churches became the center of community life. For many residents, Seneca Village represented something rare: hope, a place where people could escape some of the discrimination and instability found in lower Manhattan. By the 1850s, around 225 people lived there. That may not sound large today, but in that era, it was a meaningful and organized community. The people of Seneca Village believed they had finally found stability, but New York had other plans. As the city grew, wealthy leaders and politicians wanted to create a massive public park similar to the famous parks of Europe. They believed New York needed a grand green space, a place for beauty, recreation, and prestige. Eventually, plans for Central Park were approved. The chosen location covered more than 700 acres in Upper Manhattan, and directly inside that space stood Seneca Village. To city officials, the village became a problem. To the people living there, it was home. The city used a legal process called eminent domain. This allowed the government to take private property for public use while offering compensation. Officials claimed the land was needed for the public good, but for many residents, the compensation was not enough. And even if money was offered, it could not replace the community they had spent years building. Families protested. Some resisted leaving, but the city moved forward anyway. Then the story took a darker turn. In 1857, city officials, workers, and law enforcement forced residents out of Seneca village. Homes were demolished, churches were destroyed, roads disappeared, buildings were torn down. Families who had built lives there were pushed out, and within a short time the community was gone. Then Central Park was built over the land. The homes disappeared, the streets vanished, and over time, grass, trees, lakes, and pathways covered almost every visible sign that the community had ever existed. For decades, most Americans had no idea Seneca Village had once stood there. Millions of people visited Central Park without realizing families had once lived beneath their feet. Children played where homes once stood. Tourists relaxed near places where churches had gathered communities together. History had been buried beneath one of the most famous parks in the world, and for a long time the story was barely discussed. Part of the reason was simple. The people who lost their homes were not wealthy political elites. Many were black Americans living during a time when their stories were often ignored. History tends to remember powerful people more easily than vulnerable communities. But the story of Seneca Village did not disappear completely. Years later, historians, researchers, and archaeologists began searching for evidence of the forgotten settlement, and what they found changed how people understood Central Park forever. Excavations uncovered artifacts connected to the former residents, pieces of dishes, personal belongings, foundations from homes, objects from everyday life. These discoveries proved something important. Seneca Village had been real, not a myth, not an exaggeration, a real community with real families whose lives had been permanently changed. Modern historians now view Seneca Village as one of the most important early black communities in New York history. It represented land ownership, independence, and resilience during a period when African Americans faced enormous barriers. And its destruction raised questions that still matter today. Who gets displaced in the name of progress? Whose communities are considered valuable? And whose stories get forgotten when cities change? The story of Seneca Village also changes how many people look at Central Park. Today, the park is celebrated around the world. Millions visit every year. It is considered one of the greatest public parks ever created. But underneath that beauty is another story, a story about displacement, a story about race and class, and a story about families who lost their homes so the city could build something larger. That does not mean Central Park itself is evil, but it does mean history is more complicated than most people realize. Places that appear peaceful today can still hold painful stories underneath them, and Seneca Village is one of those stories. What makes this history especially haunting is how completely the community disappeared from public memory for so long. The people were gone, the homes vanished, even the names of many residents were forgotten. It was almost as if the community had been erased from the city itself, and in many ways it had. For years, visitors walked across the land without knowing what had once existed there. History had been hidden beneath grass and stone, but eventually the forgotten story returned. Researchers uncovered maps and records. Excavations revealed evidence of the lost neighborhood, and America slowly remembered the people of Seneca Village. Today, memorials and historical signs inside Central Park help tell visitors about the community that once stood there. The story is no longer completely hidden, but many Americans still have never heard of it. And that is why Seneca Village matters. Because history is not only about presidents, wars, and famous speeches. Sometimes history is about ordinary people trying to build stable lives in difficult times. Sometimes history is about communities that disappear so quietly that future generations almost forget they existed. And sometimes the most important stories are hidden beneath places people see every day. Seneca village was not destroyed by a natural disaster. It was not abandoned because people stopped caring. It was removed by decision, a decision made by powerful people who believed the city needed something else more. That is what makes the story feel so modern even today. Cities continue to grow, communities continue to face displacement, and debates over who benefits from development still exist everywhere. The people of Seneca village wanted safety, opportunity, land, and a future for their children. For a time, they built exactly that. But in 1857, New York erased their community from the map, and for decades, America almost erased it from memory too. Today, tourists walk through Central Park taking photos, relaxing near lakes, and sitting on open fields. Most have no idea they are standing where families once lived, prayed, worked, and raised children. Because beneath one of America's most famous parks lies the memory of a community New York chose to remove. The American town that was erased from history was real. Its people were real, and their story still matters today. If you want more hidden American history they never taught in school, subscribe for the next story.